Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. Perhaps these programs, in a sense, because of the fact that we were COVID, which seems to have finally been brought under control, maybe perhaps less pressing than they were previously. But we've been running these programs to help people through the pandemic. We've been looking at the economic, the legal, the social consequences, the medical consequences of COVID-19. And we've still got to look perhaps at the consequences for us as we move out of this pandemic and into a slightly more normal society. And it seemed to me that today it was really very appropriate to have somebody who really does know about many of these issues, which is Professor Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, who is the chair in Violent Histories and Transgenerational Trauma at the University of Stellenbosch, and has written a most extraordinary series of articles and books on many of these issues, and is perhaps our leading expert on this. So thank you so much for being part of this conversation this afternoon, Pumla. And can I ask you firstly, the statistics and the narrative seems to suggest that there's been a huge increase in gender violence. So I suppose my question to you is whether that is so, and if so, why?
It's clearly so. There's also the fact that the reporting has increased. You know, in the past, there wasn't so much exposure of the public to the various experiences of violence across the board. In other words, across the geographic board in South Africa. But now, increasingly, there's been in the newspapers today and in general in reporting, there's been a focus not just on a particular racial group in South Africa as the group that matters in terms of newsworthiness. The reporting has spread across the board, and so as a result, there is greater reporting of all these dynamics that happen in many societies. I think that, you know, the starting point perhaps for this should be on the scholarship on this question of violence against women. And in the 1970s, they developed a greater focus on the theory of patriarchy. You know, radical feminist scholars developed this scholarship around patriarchy as the main reason or main framework that can explain the violence against women. You know, the hegemony of the misogyny and patriarchy as the main touching point or touchstone of our understanding of violence against women. What I find limiting, or not very much present in these debates, is the range of expression of patriarchy. That patriarchy tends to be seen as simply as, you know, the issue of domination, male domination over women, the subordination of women, which is all it is. What's also important is that, you know, the social and institutional structural factors are the ones that reinforce these patriarchal systems. And social and structural factors differ across the board. You find that the institutional systems within, for instance, a university setting where there are various issues and dynamics and the entanglement of power issues and power dynamics are different in the context, in the social and institutional context in a university. And again, universities will differ. You know, University of Cape Town, University of Stellenbosch, University of Fort Hare, the dynamics are going to be different. And I think what's missing in this conversation is what are the different, in what ways is this patriarchy expressed in all of these contexts? And for me, one of the factors that is important is the question of power. You know, when we talk about the dominance and the power dynamic of men in relation to women, how are men positioned in various societal, you know, contexts? How are men positioned and their perception of their power, of their dominance, how is that positioned, for instance, in the context of a university, in the height of protests, for example? I mean, we know that these issues of patriarchy emerged and gender dynamics emerged within universities during in the height of protests. How are men positioned there? How are men positioned in environments where men have been disempowered, are unemployed, have no sense of dignity? They wake up every day into this yawning void of emptiness. What does it mean to be a man who's supposed to portray this image of dominance and power? And so I think that these issues that we need to focus on, what are the structural factors, what are the structural contexts within which men are positioned? And as well as in what way, in fact, do men not feel a sense of dominance within these different contexts? And then there's also the question of a culture of crime, a culture in which there isn't accountability, there is a sense of impunity, that just generally the sense of there is no respect for law. These contexts, within this social context, these ideas around male dominance and the subordination of women tend to increase. And so we need to think much more intersectionally, so that the term intersectionality isn't just a term, a catchphrase. It should be a term that really challenges us to think about how can we understand in this broad context of, the labyrinths of power, the entanglement of different ways in which men express their power, the social context themselves that reinforce these kinds of attitudes. We need to focus on all of this in order to effectively understand what it means, what patriarchy means in this context.
But why would it be? Is it just because of the pressure of the society, pressure exerted on all of us, that under COVID-19, we've had a worse scenario?
Well, it's this issue of positionality, how in a society that allows the domination of men in relation to women, in the absence of the actual feeling of power, men tend to find other forms of expression of their power, and violence is one of these ways. It's unfortunate that in our societies across, globally, violence and aggression tend to be glorified as ways of expressing power. I think until we realize that power cannot only be expressed, or should not only be expressed in terms of control and dominance. Power can be expressed also in the form of, the fight for social justice, for instance. I mean, I was thinking when you were asking at the beginning, when I was thinking of framing my response to you, I thought of other forms of expression of masculinity, that patriarchal masculinities. They are often informed by this idea of power as meaning control and dominance. And yet there are other models in our society, there are many of them, but the two that came to mind, Archbishop Tutu, and Nelson Mandela, is a different kind of, of expression of manhood or of masculinity, one that is caring, one that responds to the question of how do you fight for social justice? I mean, men have done this in the context of fight against racism. The dynamics are very similar. Racism is an expression of power, of racial power, and men understand this very clearly. Black men especially understand this very clearly. Well, and white men, those who are fighting against racism, they understand the role of power in that context of race. It should end the fight against racism, should really inform as well the fight against patriarchy. When you think, I mentioned earlier how certain movements and certain social contexts allow patriarchy to thrive, one which is impunity, non-accountability. when you think about, for instance, the context of the protests within universities, and how even in those contexts, patriarchy, rather the issue of violence against women increased at the universities around the time or since that time. And part of the reason, in my view, is that there was a certain permission that is given psychologically when, you know, there isn't a sense of carefulness about how we behave to one another in general, not just behaving towards one another in relation to one another in the gender context, but in general. But when there is a sense of allowable, you know, expression of violence and aggression, it spills over into these ideas of dominance as a masculinity feature of expression of men's position in relation to women. So it thrives, that kind of thrives more. This is why I think we have seen an increase in violence against women within these university contexts.
I mean, is South Africa an outlier? I mean, look, the world is full of patriarchy. I mean, you only have to look at Donald Trump to realize that. But I suppose the point I'm making is, are we worse? And is that partly explained by our awful history?
There is no question that these histories of violence, you know, these, as I said in the beginning, a context that allows expression of violence tends to yield, you know, there's a kind of an embeddedness of expressions of violence that are allowed in a particular social context, that because violence is sort of has been normalized. So violence of all kinds is normalized. Patriarchy is a violent expression of human beingness, you know, of the male kind. Male, you know, human beings think that in order to be a man, you have to express patriarchy. Now, if the context, the social systems are such that they promote violence, they promote aggression in general, the expression of that power of violence and aggression will be naturalized or normalized when it comes to these male expression of dominance, because violence, you know, is an expression of dominance over another. It's a power over another, and patriarchy is a power over others. Now, if the nature of society, the social systems themselves are governed by this, or rather this is allowed, it's been made normal, it's been normalized, then this also becomes normal too, so that from, you know, it becomes a slippery slope. If you can express, you know, your masculinity in this particular way, then to actually reclaim your right to, quote unquote, your right to dominance, then your right to dominance is also expressed in terms of making women the subordinate subject, and so violence becomes easy in that way. I can't say whether we are worse off, you know, than others, but statistics show that the, you know, rape of women in South Africa, violence against women in South Africa is among the highest in the world.
In the world, yes.
And that history of violence is part of it, because again, it's a sense in which it becomes normalized. Now, one of the things that I've talked about in my work, or that I write about, is, or that I explore rather, is the degree to which the violence, remember, is not only of the physical kind, there's violence also in terms of how people are governed, you know, how the state doesn't care for people who vote them in power, and don't treat people with respect, don't treat people with dignity. And that, you know, it becomes sort of like the definition of what we are as human beings, one to another. And those who want to feel a sense of power, precisely because they don't have it otherwise in society. Men, for instance, who do not have, they're disempowered, their very position within society is one which is disempowered. One of the questions that interests me about this question of disempowered men is the context, again, of context where at a university that is historically white, to what extent does the racial disempowerment of men feed into this idea of patriarchy as an aggressive expression that then, morphs into aggression against women? So these are some of the questions that I'm very interested in exploring. And there's no question that a culture of violence, and violence, again, not just a physical kind, but one that is expressed in terms of, just an absence, a total absence of care or of caring for people who are considered to be in the bottom of the economic rung.
So when I listen to you, it seems to me that when people make statements about, about we've got to stop this violence against women, as commendable as all that is, actually that's not going to stop it. It does seem to me that what you're telling us is a massive structural problem here.
Absolutely. I mean,
so
I think...
How does one begin to address this?
This is always the question. I mean, we ask this question about racism. How does one begin to address this?
I want to talk about racism in a moment.
You can do this. But one of the, we have, first of all, we've got to understand that, it's not one thing. I think the unitary explanatory context doesn't help us to understand the complexity of what is going on. It's important for us to understand that these issues require a look at our whole post-apartheid democratic situation, to reflect on what is it that we're doing wrong? What is it that we're doing to promote or to reinforce these kinds of problems? If we simply say it's patriarchy, it's men's dominance, it's not gonna really help us. But if you look at what is it within these social systems, what is it that these arrangements of relationships in our social context, in our institutional context, what is it about them that reinforce these structures, these relationships? And until we really look at it in that complex, in that way of this disentangling all of these labyrinths that relate to all of these aspects that reinforce the patriarchy, we will not be able to address fully the problem, including really looking into how do we create, how do we support manhood that is proud, that fights against, against social injustice. You do that by empowering people so that they feel a sense of worth about who they are. If people wake up feeling a sense of worthlessness, and they happen to be men who depend on this model of patriarchy, the dominance model, the control model, they are going to find the weaker, whoever is weaker, to express their dominance. There's other, this conversation, Dennis, is so important. We haven't talked about what about the issue, the problem of experiences of trauma. Now, most feminists have really not been too embracing of this idea of looking at the history of particular individual men. And I think it's important not to actually individualize this, but rather to look at the social structures. But if you think about how our society has been affected by history of trauma collectively, and our understanding within psychology that trauma has its impact, its continuing impact, its transgenerational impact on people who are affected by trauma, not only as individuals, but within communities and therefore within societies. We've got to also talk about that history of traumatization as well, this history of violence and, a traumatizing violence in communities and large communities, and its impact on the expression of patriarchy.
So whilst I wish to continue this because of time, I wanted to move on, if I may, to the broader issue of race. And I wanted to ask you this. The Constitution, of course, foresaw a society, essentially a non-racial, non-sexist society. we really started to canvass the fact that it can hardly be a non-sexist society when you've got the patriarchy. But the question of the race question seems to me, we've got some people saying you shouldn't take account of race at all. And then you've got people who, in a sense, are into a particular form of identity politics in which it subsumes everything. I suppose what I'm asking you is, I seem to have some anxiety that the debate about race has just gone off the rails, and we're not really having a constructive debate about redress in a real structural sense with regard to race. And how do we do that? And what do you say to people who say, well, simply because you use race as the criterion, essentially you're perpetuating, the same sort of ideological framework as previously was the case?
For me, the two ways of responding to it, or rather aspects of my response to your question. One is there is the question of race in a particular context of people who are upward, who have the potential, to engage professionally or to benefit. Actually, the easiest way to put this is people who have the potential to benefit from the transformation in our country. In other words, to benefit from policies of, affirmative action, and all, Black economic empowerment, people who have, the power already, the privilege to benefit from these structures that are built in within us, our constitution. So that's one group. So when we talk about race within that group, we there's a different language, of equality, of issues of equality, what we mean by equality. But there's the group of people who are the majority of Black people who have suffered over generations, who are nowhere near the possibility of benefiting from these policies of affirmative action and, Black economic empowerment. The majority of our people who have inherited poverty, these structures of poverty. I remember, Dennis, what time is it now? I want to be also aware of your time limitation.
It's about 4 minutes to 3.
4 minutes to 3, really? Okay, so let me say quickly that in 2006, there was a very important document that was research that was commissioned by the then Thabo Mbeki, the then president of the country. It was called A Nation in the Making. This was a document that was a 10-year review. Where are we as a country materially post-apartheid South Africa? The overall conclusion of that document painted a grim picture. And essentially, I remember very clearly because a group of us were asked by Fred Khumalo of the Sunday Times to write pieces on various aspects of this finding. One of which was the transgenerational effects of poverty. Now, 2006 was a time when HIV was a pandemic in its height. And so the researchers found, who were researching on this, A Nation in the Making, they found that family structure had been broken. Most of the people who are affected are young people. Now, this is where I would really want us to focus on. Then when we think about this, our democracy, we've got to think about the generation of South Africans, not only those who are at universities, because most of the noise around, I don't say that in a negative way, but most of the volume about anti-racism struggles really occurs within the settings where people already have their foot in the door. The majority of South Africans, where these questions of social injustice are really relevant, are nowhere near to benefiting from these policies. Zaki Ahmad came to our university to speak about violence. It's on our website. It's a powerful, really eye-opening presentation about what is violence. When people say, these people are thrashing everything, they're thrashing the trains and so on, Zaki really distilled it for us to understand that the state itself, in the same way that the state of apartheid was violent against the majority of South Africans, there is a violence that is perpetuated today. And so the repetition of these cycles, not just of poverty, but the cycles of violence we've seen during the pandemic, for instance, the police violence. I'm really jumping, making key points here. That is a playing out of the same violence that occurred under apartheid, where the police today are not reflecting on the fact that we are under different circumstances. I mean, think, for instance, about the march by the people who are marching, who are, work at restaurants. Why did the police become violent? Why did the police, use violence when they could understand from their own perspective that we are all suffering the same consequences of this COVID? We must be gentle, we must be caring. Why unleash this violent power? So when we think about constitutional democracy, we're going to think about what is it that our state, our government, our systems have inherited from the past and are simply acting it out without reflecting on the question that we are under a new system. So even when you think about racism, we've got to think about issues of social justice, not only around the question of racism, equality of races, but the equality of life, of indignity that continues to be suffered by people who are inheritors of this cycle of violence that have been passed on transgenerationally from way before apartheid until now. And the danger of this being that it's the young people who are suffering the consequences of this past. And until we address it at that level, we are going to experience that the children of these young people who are struggling to make do, to have a dignified life, their children in 20 years' time are going to do exactly the same, are going to be suffering from exactly the same consequences. And so we've got to think really meaningfully about what does it mean? What is it that is required for us to do to deal with this issue? When I wrote this piece for Fred Khumalo, I said, I ended it by saying, if we don't find some way to repay the debts owed to the casualties of change in our society, in our post-apartheid society, their anger will blow up long before Jacob Zuma's rallying song, Letu Mshini Wam, actually inspires them to do just that. This was in 2006, and we have now actually witnessed the blowing up of all of that already.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because Sidney Kentridge, our great advocate, many years ago, warned the previous government and those who supported it that if they carried on like this, they would have destroyed better than they ever could have contemplated. And I think what he meant by that was precisely the point, was just how little we have essentially contemplated what that history did and how we're supposed to repair it, rather than on the margins, but rather in the substance. I'm afraid we have run out of time, but I really, this has been such a fantastic conversation that I've got to get you back to do another one, because you're quite right. We should be talking about this a lot more than we have. But in the interim, since I know both of us have got time constraints, can I thank you so much, both for the work you're doing and for, in fact, articulating this so wonderfully.
Thank you.
This afternoon. I'm sure people listening to this will have lots of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you very much.
Our pleasure.